The evening sun was setting behind the line of old oak trees, painting the small town streets in shades of orange and gold. The day had been long but peaceful for a man named David, who worked as a delivery driver. He had just finished his last stop and was finally heading home. His van smelled faintly of cardboard and coffee. He rolled the window down, letting the cool air touch his tired face. For a moment, everything felt calm. He turned on the radio, humming softly to a song he hadn't heard since high school. Life wasn't perfect, but it was steady. He was proud of the life he had built with his wife and 2 little girls. He picked up his phone at a red light and called his wife to let her know he was on his way. She laughed softly on the other end, teasing him for always being late for dinner. He promised he'd be home in 10 minutes. As he hung up, he thought about the warm food waiting for him and the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing through the house. It was the kind of thought that made him smile, the kind that made all the hard work feel worth it. He drove down the main road, almost empty at that hour. Streetlights flickered on one by one. He was only a few blocks from home when he noticed something strange in his rearview mirror, flashing red and blue lights. For a second, he thought the patrol car was trying to pass, but it stayed behind him. Confused, he pulled over to the side of the road, his heart beating a little faster. He had never been in trouble with the law before. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe a taillight was out, maybe they just needed to check something. He took a deep breath and waited. 2 police officers stepped out of the patrol car. One of them walked quickly, hand already resting on his holster. The other stayed near the back, shining a flashlight at David's license plate. David rolled down his window and tried to stay calm. He greeted them politely and asked if something was wrong. The officer didn't answer right away. He just stared at David, then at the van, then back at David again. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer finally said. David hesitated for a second. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'm just coming from work." The officer's tone grew sharp. "I said step out of the vehicle now." David nodded quickly, trying not to appear nervous. He unbuckled his seatbelt and got out, hands clearly visible. The evening air felt colder suddenly. Cars passed slowly, their drivers turning their heads to see what was happening. The second officer came around to the front of the van, one hand on his flashlight, the other resting close to his gun. The first officer circled David, eyeing him as if he were a threat. "What's in the van?" the officer demanded. "Delivery boxes," David said. "I work for a delivery company. You can check if you want." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You match the description of someone involved in a robbery earlier today." David blinked in disbelief. "A robbery?" "I've been working all day, sir. You can check my company GPS." "Quiet," the officer snapped, stepping closer. "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle." David did as told, his palms pressing against the cool metal of the van. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He kept thinking this had to be some kind of mistake. He hadn't done anything wrong. The officer began patting him down roughly, muttering under his breath. The second officer stood behind him, flashlight still shining on his back. The light made his shadow stretch long and trembling on the ground. Across the street, a woman walking her dog stopped and pulled out her phone. She began recording quietly. Another neighbor opened their window curtain, watching from inside. Something about the way the officers were acting didn't feel right. They weren't treating David like someone they were questioning. They were treating him like someone they already decided was guilty. The first officer pushed harder on David's shoulder. "Don't move!" "I'm not," David said, voice shaking. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on." The officer's tone grew more hostile. "You people are always trying to play innocent." Those words hit David like a punch. He turned his head slightly, eyes wide, but before he could say anything, the officer shoved him forward, pressing him against the van. The second officer moved closer, hand now gripping his gun. The street was silent except for the hum of streetlights and the distant sound of a dog barking. David felt a deep fear rising in his chest. He wasn't sure what they were going to do next. He thought about his wife waiting at home. He thought about his daughters asking where he was. He didn't want them to see his name on the news. The first officer reached for his radio, muttering something David couldn't hear. Then suddenly he pulled out his gun and pointed it at David's head. David froze. Time seemed to stop. He could feel the metal barrel just inches from his skin. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't move, didn't blink. His mind screamed for him to stay still, to say nothing that could make it worse. He wanted to cry out, to tell them he wasn't a criminal, but no words came out. The air around him felt heavy. Every second stretched endlessly. Across the street, the woman recording gasped. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's got a gun on him." The officer's voice was cold. "Don't move or I swear—" "Please," David finally said, his voice breaking. "I haven't done anything. I'm just trying to get home." The other officer looked uncertain for a moment but said nothing. He just watched, his hand still near his weapon, his face unreadable. The street felt like a movie scene frozen in tension. One wrong move could change everything. Another car slowed down nearby. A man leaned out the window and shouted, "Hey, I'm recording this." The officer turned his head sharply, yelling at the driver to move along. But by then, several more people had their phones out. Windows were opening, voices whispering. People could see what was happening, and they didn't like it. David stood still, praying silently. The fear was unlike anything he had ever felt before. He wasn't thinking about the officers anymore. He was thinking about whether he'd make it home tonight. He thought about the small family photo tucked into his wallet. He thought about the promise he'd made to his wife that morning, to be safe, to come home. After what felt like an eternity, another police car pulled up. A senior officer stepped out, looking confused. He walked over quickly, asking what was going on. The officer holding the gun kept his focus on David, mumbling something about a robbery suspect. The senior officer frowned. "He's in a delivery uniform," he said. "Did you even check his plates?" There was a pause. The officer hesitated, lowering the gun just slightly. The senior one stepped closer, asking David for his ID. David handed it over with shaking hands. The officer looked at the ID, then at the van, then sighed deeply. "This man's not your suspect," he said. "You need to release him." The two officers looked at each other, silent and tense. Finally, the one who had held the gun stepped back, muttering something about miscommunication. He holstered his weapon and avoided eye contact. The senior officer motioned for David to step aside and take a deep breath. He asked if David was okay. David just nodded, too shaken to speak. His legs felt weak, his hands numb. The people across the street were still recording, still whispering. David got back into his van, staring straight ahead for a long time before starting the engine. The senior officer apologized quietly, saying there had been confusion over a vehicle description. But deep down, David knew it wasn't just confusion. He knew what it really was, a rush to judgment because of how he looked. He didn't say anything, though. He just drove away slowly, heart still pounding, eyes wet with tears he refused to let fall. When he reached home, his wife was waiting at the door, smiling until she saw his face. He didn't need to explain much. She could see it in his eyes. He told her what happened, every detail, and she just held him tightly, refusing to let go. His daughters peeked from the hallway, confused by the silence in the room. David managed a small smile for them, trying to hide the fear still lingering inside him. Later that night, as he sat on the couch, his phone buzzed. It was a message from a friend. "Is this you in the video?" He opened the link, and there it was, footage of the officer pointing a gun at him spreading across social media. The caption read, "Unarmed man held at gunpoint by police caught on camera." David stared at the screen for a long time, his hands trembling. The video was already being shared thousands of times. He didn't know what would happen next, but something told him this was only the beginning. He didn't want fame or attention. He only wanted fairness, a reason, an answer to why a man just trying to go home had been treated like a criminal. As the night grew quiet, he looked out the window at the same street where it all happened. The flashing lights were gone, but their reflection still burned in his memory. Somewhere deep inside, he hoped that maybe, just maybe, this video would make people see what really happened, not just to him, but to so many others who never got the chance to speak. And for the first time that night, David whispered to himself, "It's not over." That night, sleep refused to come to David. He kept replaying every moment in his head, the lights flashing in his mirror, the officer's cold voice, the barrel of the gun only inches away. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. The fear came rushing back like a wave he couldn't stop. His wife tried to comfort him, but her eyes were full of worry too. Neither of them spoke much. The only sound in the house was the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. He sat on the edge of the bed looking at his phone. The video that had been shared earlier was now everywhere. Millions had seen it overnight. News channels were already using the clip in their morning reports. The captions all said the same thing. Unarmed delivery driver held at gunpoint during traffic stop. Some called it a case of police bias. Others called it a misunderstanding. But David knew what it really was. Fear, power, and judgment mixed together in one dangerous moment. He didn't want fame. He didn't even want an apology anymore. He just wanted peace. But peace wasn't going to come easily now. His phone kept buzzing with messages from people he didn't know. Strangers thanking him for staying calm. Some telling their own stories of unfair treatment. And others asking him to speak to the media. He didn't reply to any of them. He just stared at the messages until the screen dimmed. By morning, reporters were outside his house. A line of cars had gathered, and neighbors peeked through their curtains to see what was happening. When he stepped outside to get some air, microphones were already waiting for him. "David, how do you feel after what happened last night? Do you plan to press charges? Do you believe the officers acted out of racial bias?" He didn't know what to say. His voice felt trapped somewhere deep inside. He wanted to tell them everything, how scared he was, how powerless he felt. But he also didn't want his pain to become someone else's story. His wife stepped in and asked the reporters to leave. They didn't at first, but after a while, the police came to control the crowd, and slowly the street grew quiet again. Inside, David sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he didn't even drink. The steam rose and faded while he stared at it. "Why me?" he whispered under his breath. "I didn't do anything." His wife placed her hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Sometimes the truth finds a way to show itself, even when people don't want to see it." He looked at her, her eyes steady and calm, and realized she was right. Maybe this happened for a reason. Maybe the world needed to see what was really going on. But part of him still wished it hadn't been him. That afternoon, the delivery company called. His manager spoke gently, asking if he was okay. The company had seen the video too. They offered him time off, but David insisted on returning to work soon. He needed to feel normal again. He needed to prove to himself that life could still go on. But outside, life had changed. The city was buzzing with talk about what had happened. People were protesting outside the police station, demanding answers. Signs filled the air. "Justice for David, and we deserve better." News vans parked across the street, capturing every moment. Meanwhile, the police department held a press conference. The chief stood in front of cameras, reading from a prepared statement. He said the officers were following proper procedure during an active investigation. He added that there had been a report of a robbery suspect matching David's description, and that the officers had acted out of caution. When David heard those words on TV, something inside him broke. Caution? Was that what they called pointing a gun at someone's head for no reason? He felt anger, but it wasn't loud or wild. It was quiet, heavy, and cold. His wife turned off the television, and for a while, neither of them spoke. A few days later, David decided to visit his mother, who lived on the other side of town. He needed her calm voice, her familiar home that smelled of baked bread and lavender. When she opened the door, she hugged him tight and whispered, "I saw the video. I thank God you came home that night." He nodded, trying not to cry. "I don't even know how to feel anymore, Mom. One minute I was just driving home, and now my face is everywhere." His mother guided him to the old couch they had since he was a kid. "You've always been strong," she said. "But strength isn't just about standing tall. Sometimes it's about standing up for what's right, even when your knees shake." Her words stayed with him. He realized he couldn't just hide from what had happened. Too many people were reaching out, sharing their own stories, their own pain. Maybe it was time to speak. The next day, David agreed to an interview with a local reporter known for honest storytelling. He sat on his porch, the camera pointed at him, the wind gently moving the leaves in the background. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. He didn't shout or accuse anyone. He simply told the truth. "I wasn't angry," he said. "I was scared. I didn't know if I'd see my family again. I just want people to understand that fear. It's not about hate. It's about how quickly things can go wrong when someone decides you're guilty before you even speak." The interview aired that night. It was calm, emotional, and powerful. It touched hearts all across the country. Viewers said it was the first time they truly understood what it felt like to be in that moment, to be helpless, to be judged, to be afraid for your life for doing nothing wrong. After the interview, David's phone exploded again, but this time the messages felt different. There were lawyers offering help, activists offering support, and even a few retired police officers expressing sympathy and shame. One message stood out. It was from a member of a federal civil rights group. They wanted to meet him and learn more about what happened. David agreed. The following week, he met with 2 investigators from the organization in a small office downtown. They listened carefully as he described everything: the stop, the words, the gun. They asked for copies of the videos and any documents he had from the police. One of them took notes while the other reassured him, "You did the right thing by staying calm, but now it's time for accountability." David didn't know what that meant exactly, but he nodded. For the first time since the incident, he felt like someone was listening, really listening. Later that evening, when he returned home, his wife greeted him with a warm smile. She had been following everything closely, but she also made sure to keep their daughters' lives normal. The girls were playing with their toys, laughing as if nothing in the world was wrong. Seeing them laugh made David's heart ache and heal at the same time. That night, as they sat down for dinner, his phone buzzed again. This time it was another video, new footage from a neighbor's security camera. It showed the same scene but from a different angle. The video clearly captured the moment the officer pressed the gun to David's head. It also recorded the words the officer used, words the police report had left out completely. David watched the clip in silence. His wife covered her mouth in shock. "They lied," she whispered. "They actually lied." He didn't respond. He just stared at the screen. The truth finally laid bare for the world to see. The next morning, that new video spread online even faster than the first. It sparked even greater outrage. People demanded a full investigation. Politicians, celebrities, and public figures began speaking out, calling for justice. The police department, under growing pressure, announced that the 2 officers had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. But the community wasn't satisfied. They wanted more than suspension. They wanted change. For David, the noise outside kept growing, but inside, life was still quiet. He spent his days at home taking care of his family, waiting for what would come next. Sometimes he sat by the window watching people walk by, wondering how many of them had seen his face on the news. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't even feel brave. He felt like a man caught in a storm he never asked for. But deep down, something was shifting. He was no longer just surviving the moment. He was learning to stand inside it, to face it head on. That evening, he got a call from one of the investigators who had met him earlier. The man's voice was calm but serious. "David," he said, "the Department of Justice has taken an interest in your case. They're reviewing the footage. We can't promise anything yet, but this might lead to something bigger." David didn't say anything for a while. He looked out at the night sky, stars faint behind the clouds. "I just want the truth," he said finally. "That's all," the investigator replied. "And the truth is what we're going to find." As David hung up, he felt something new. Not fear, not anger, but quiet strength. Maybe this was the beginning of something that could make a real difference. Maybe what had happened that night would not be in vain. He turned off his phone, kissed his wife goodnight, and whispered a small prayer of thanks. The world outside was still restless, but inside his home, for the first time in days, there was peace. And somewhere far away, in a quiet office filled with files and evidence, a federal task force began to take notice. Days passed, but the story didn't fade away. It spread across the country like wildfire. People were talking about it in schools, offices, and restaurants. The video had become more than a clip. It had become a conversation. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, but only David truly knew how heavy it felt to live through it. He tried to go about his life as normally as he could, but things had changed. When he went to the grocery store, people whispered or approached him to say how brave he was. Some wanted pictures, others wanted to thank him for staying calm that night. He appreciated the kindness, but deep down he wished he could just go back to being invisible, an ordinary man driving home after work. At home, the calls kept coming. Reporters, lawyers, civil rights groups, even pastors from churches he'd never heard of. Everyone wanted to help or hear his side. It was overwhelming. He had never been someone who liked attention. He worked quietly, lived simply, and tried to do right by his family. Now, suddenly the whole world knew his name. The federal civil rights investigators had promised to stay in touch, And true to their word, they did. They began asking more questions about that night. They requested access to the body camera footage from the police department. But the department claimed the footage was corrupted. It didn't sit right with the investigators. They knew something wasn't adding up. One afternoon, David sat with one of the investigators at a small cafe downtown. The man was calm and professional, but his eyes were sharp. He had been through hundreds of similar cases, and he knew when something smelled wrong. "I've seen this pattern before," he said quietly. "They'll say the footage is missing, the report was incomplete, and the officers acted in self-defense. It's the same story every time. But this time they won't get away with it. The videos from the public are strong evidence." David listened carefully, nodding. "All I want," he said softly, "is the truth. I don't hate anyone. I just want to make sure no one else goes through what I did." The investigator smiled faintly. "That's exactly why we're here." Meanwhile, tension in the city grew. Protesters continued to gather outside the police station every evening. They carried candles and signs chanting for fairness and justice. The police tried to calm the situation by promising an internal review, but few believed them anymore. David didn't attend the protests, but he watched from home, moved by the faces of people he had never met standing up for him. Some held signs with his name, others simply held their hands up in silence. It made him emotional. He never thought his story would touch so many hearts. At the same time, the officers involved were nowhere to be seen. They had been placed on leave, but rumors spread that they were still being paid and protected by the department. This made the public even angrier. Then, one evening, David received an unexpected call. It was from a retired police officer named Thomas, who had served in the same town for over 20 years. His voice was calm but filled with regret. "I've seen a lot of things in my career," Thomas said, "and what happened to you should never have happened. I'm sorry for what my brothers did. Not all of us are like that." David was silent for a moment. "Thank you," he said finally. "It means a lot to hear that. There's something you should know," Thomas continued. "Those two officers, they've had complaints before. I remember a few cases that were quietly swept away. The department protected them." David's grip on the phone tightened. "You're sure?" "I wouldn't call you if I wasn't," the man replied. "Just be careful. Things might get rough before they get better." After hanging up, David sat in silence, staring at the wall. His wife asked what was wrong, and he told her what the retired officer had said. She didn't look surprised. "I had a feeling," she whispered. "People like that don't just change overnight." The next day, the federal team received the same information through their own channels. They found out that both officers had multiple prior complaints: use of force, false arrests, verbal abuse, but none of them had ever reached the public. The department had closed each case quietly, labeling them unsubstantiated. Now, with the viral video and growing public anger, that was no longer possible to hide. Soon, national media arrived. Reporters from major networks came to town, setting up cameras on the same street where the incident happened. They interviewed neighbors, community leaders, and even children who had seen the video. Everyone had something to say, but David didn't want to be on camera anymore. He turned down most interview requests. He wanted the focus to be on change, not on him as a person. His wife helped him stay grounded. Every morning, she reminded him to eat, to rest, and to take things one day at a time. One evening after dinner, the news showed a segment about the case. The reporter said that federal officials had officially opened a civil rights investigation into the police department. The words hit David like a rush of air. He didn't speak, but his wife squeezed his hand tightly. "This is it," she said softly. "It's starting." The following week, federal investigators arrived in the town. They were serious, quiet, and professional. They interviewed everyone, from witnesses to officers to the police chief. They reviewed records, emails, and footage. Nothing escaped their eyes. At first, the local police tried to cooperate, but as soon as the investigators started asking about old cases, things got tense. Files went missing. Computers malfunctioned. It was clear that someone was trying to cover things up. But the task force had something stronger: community trust. People who had once been afraid began to speak up. One by one, residents came forward to share their own stories. Some said they had been pulled over for no reason. Others said they had been treated unfairly during small incidents. Every story built a bigger picture of a pattern that couldn't be denied anymore. David didn't know all the details of what the investigators were doing, but he could feel the energy around him changing. Neighbors stopped him on the street to thank him. Some cried, saying they had finally found courage because of him. It was overwhelming, but it also gave him strength. One night, as he sat with his family watching the sunset from their porch, his phone buzzed again. It was one of the federal agents. "We're making progress," the agent said. "There's something big coming soon. Just stay patient." David didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. The tone in the agent's voice told him enough. Something was about to happen. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in town grew heavy. Police cars were more visible. The department released short statements claiming they were being unfairly targeted. But by now, people had lost faith in their words. Then early one morning, while David was having breakfast, he saw a black SUV parked across the street. Two men in suits stepped out, looked around, and then drove off. His wife noticed too. "Do you think they're here because of the investigation?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, though he wasn't sure. All he knew was that things were no longer in the shadows. The truth was on its way to the surface. Later that day, one of the investigators called again. "David, I need you to be ready for anything," he said. "We found solid evidence, false reports, missing files, and proof that your stop was never justified. We're preparing to move forward. It won't be long now." David felt a strange mix of fear and relief. For months he had carried this weight alone, wondering if anyone would ever believe him. Now people not only believed him, they were fighting for him. That night he couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't fear keeping him awake. It was hope. He stood by the window looking at the quiet street that had once been filled with flashing lights and shouting voices. It looked peaceful again. He thought about how much had changed in such a short time. From being forced to the ground to becoming the face of a movement. It didn't feel real. But he also knew that his story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been treated unfairly and stayed silent. Before going to bed, he whispered a silent promise to himself. No matter how long it took, he would see this through. He owed it to his family, to his community, and to anyone who had ever felt powerless. The next morning he received another call. This time the voice on the other end sounded urgent. "David, we need you to come in. The task force has uncovered something huge. The case has officially reached the federal level." He didn't say a word for a moment. He just closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and said quietly, "Thank you." He hung up and turned to his wife. "It's happening," he said. She looked at him with tears in her eyes but a proud smile on her face. "Then let's be ready." Outside, the world was waking up. Cars moved, children laughed on their way to school, and the morning sun shone on the same street that had once been a place of fear. But now it was becoming something else, a symbol of courage, truth, and change, and somewhere downtown, in a government office filled with papers, computers, and determination, a federal task force was quietly preparing to take action that would shake the town to its core. That night, after the video spread across the internet, things started to move faster than anyone could have imagined. The small town that had once been quiet was now filled with reporters, camera crews, and people holding signs outside the police station. Some demanded justice. Others wanted answers. But one thing was clear. No one could ignore what had happened to that innocent man anymore. Inside his small living room, the man sat with his wife and two daughters. The television played the same video again and again. Each time it showed the officer's gun pointed at his head, his wife turned away, unable to watch. He sat quietly, his hands clasped together, his eyes heavy but calm. It had been days since he had slept properly. Every sound outside made him flinch. Every car that slowed near his house made his heart race. He had done nothing wrong, yet he felt like the world was watching him as if he was on trial. His phone buzzed constantly, journalists calling for interviews, friends checking on him, strangers sending messages of support. But one message stood out. It was from someone who claimed to work with a federal civil rights task force. The message was short and respectful. It said they wanted to speak privately about what had happened, and that they were already reviewing the case. For the first time since that terrible night, he felt a small spark of hope. A few days later, two people from the task force came to his home. They didn't come in suits or with cameras. They came dressed simply, carrying folders and notebooks. They sat with him at his kitchen table, listening quietly as he told the whole story from start to finish. He showed them the uniform he had worn that day, the receipts from his delivery route, the call logs proving he was working when the officers stopped him. The agents listened carefully, taking notes, asking gentle questions. When he was done, one of them said softly, "We believe you, and we're going to look into this deeply." Those words meant more than they could have known. For weeks, he had been made to feel like his truth didn't matter. But now someone finally believed him. The task force didn't waste time. They contacted the local police department, requesting all files related to the stop, including body camera footage and written reports. The department claimed that the footage had been lost due to a technical error. That response raised a red flag immediately. Federal investigators had seen that excuse too many times before. They quietly began checking records, phone logs, and internal messages within the department. What they found made their hearts sink. It turned out that both officers involved in the incident had several previous complaints filed against them, most of them involving unnecessary force or racial bias. Most of those complaints had been dismissed or resolved internally, but the investigators noticed a pattern of intimidation, false reporting, and cover-ups. One investigator said later that reading those reports felt like looking through a history that everyone had tried to hide. Meanwhile, the man tried to live his life as normally as possible, though nothing felt normal anymore. When he went out, people recognized him. Some thanked him for speaking out, while others looked at him with judgment or suspicion. His wife worried about his safety, and his daughters had trouble sleeping at night. Their once peaceful home now felt surrounded by invisible tension. But despite everything, he didn't give up. He kept meeting with the task force, handing over every piece of evidence he had. One afternoon, they showed him something that shook him to his core. They had recovered partial body cam footage from a server that had not been wiped clean. It clearly showed him standing calmly with his hands visible. The officer's voice could be heard yelling, though nothing in the video suggested any threat. Then the video cut out abruptly. But it was enough. Enough to prove that the report filed by the officers, claiming he had resisted arrest, was a lie. The investigators decided to dig even deeper. They spoke with residents around the neighborhood. Several came forward to say they had seen similar incidents before. People being stopped without reason, yelled at, treated unfairly, and then too afraid to speak out. One older man said he had seen those same officers harassing a teenager months earlier. The more the task force uncovered, the more serious the case became. It was no longer just about one traffic stop. It was about a pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for years. Back at the police station, tension grew. The officers who had been involved started acting nervous. Rumors spread through the department that federal agents were looking into everyone's records. Some officers who had once supported their colleagues began to distance themselves, afraid of being caught in the fallout. The chief of police tried to hold a press conference, insisting that his department always followed the law. But when reporters pressed him for the missing footage and the growing list of complaints, his answers became vague, behind closed doors. He called an emergency meeting with his top officers, but what he didn't know was that the task force already had warrants ready to access their internal files and emails. The clock was ticking. One evening, as the man sat on his porch watching the sunset, his phone rang. It was one of the federal investigators. They spoke quietly, saying, "We've found enough evidence to move forward. It's going to take some time, but justice is coming." He felt a weight lift from his chest. For weeks, he had lived with fear and doubt. Now there was finally a sign that the truth was being seen by people who could do something about it. Still, he didn't want revenge. He just wanted peace. He wanted his daughters to grow up in a world where people didn't have to fear those meant to protect them. In the following days, more news stories appeared about the investigation. Reporters revealed that one of the officers had been suspended in another town years earlier for excessive force, but was rehired quietly in this one. That detail shocked the public. People began demanding accountability not just for the two officers, but for the entire system that allowed them to keep their badges. The man's story started being discussed on national television. Civil rights groups held peaceful rallies calling for reform. Politicians began to speak about police accountability again. What had begun as one terrifying night on a quiet road had become a symbol of something much larger. Inside the task force's headquarters, the agents prepared their final report. They had built a strong case based on evidence, interviews, and internal communications. One message stood out: a text from one of the officers to another on the night of the incident. It showed them mocking the man and bragging about teaching him a lesson. That message would later become a key piece of evidence. When the report was complete, it was sent to the Department of Justice for review. The case was no longer just local. It had reached the federal level. The man sat quietly with his family when he received the news. His wife started to cry softly, holding his hand. He didn't say much, only nodded and whispered, "Maybe this time the truth won't be buried." Outside, the sound of distant thunder rolled through the evening sky. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but everyone could feel it coming. In that moment, sitting in his small house with his family, he didn't feel like a victim anymore. He felt like someone who had stood up to something much bigger than himself and lived to see the truth begin to surface. The night grew darker, but in his heart, there was light. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that justice, though slow, was still possible. The morning sun rose quietly over the small town, but it didn't feel like an ordinary day. There was a strange tension in the air, something heavy that no one could quite explain. People woke up to the sound of helicopters in the distance, and a few early commuters noticed a group of black SUVs parked near the local police station. They didn't know it yet, but something big was about to happen. Inside his home, the man who had once been just another delivery driver sat at the kitchen table with his wife. He hadn't slept much. He'd been thinking about the last call from the federal investigators. They had told him that action was coming soon, but they hadn't said when. His wife poured him a cup of coffee and said softly, "Whatever happens, you've done your part. You told the truth." He nodded slowly, staring at the steam rising from his cup. "I just hope it really means something," he whispered. Across town, the federal task force was already in motion. Inside their temporary command office, agents reviewed final instructions. They had spent weeks gathering evidence: body cam fragments, written lies, hidden emails, text messages, and testimonies from other victims. Everything pointed to a clear abuse of power that had been buried for years. The officers involved had crossed the line too many times, and now it was time for accountability. The lead agent, a calm and determined woman, gave her final briefing. "We go in quietly, no chaos, no warnings. We arrest them based on the warrants signed last night. This isn't about making a scene. It's about showing that no one is above the law." The agents nodded. Within minutes, they moved out in formation, their vehicles rolling down the quiet streets toward the police precinct. At the station, the morning shift had just begun. Officers were sipping coffee, talking about the weekend, unaware that their world was about to change. Then just after 8, a convoy of federal SUVs stopped outside. The doors opened and agents stepped out, badges visible, moving with purpose. Within seconds, the building was surrounded. One of the local officers looked out the window and froze. We've got company," he said nervously. The chief came out of his office, frowning. "Company? What do you mean?" Before he could finish, the doors opened and the task force entered, calm but firm. The lead agent stepped forward and presented the papers. "We're here on federal authority. We have warrants for several officers. Everyone else, step aside and remain calm." A stunned silence filled the room. The two officers who had been at the center of the case exchanged panicked looks. One of them tried to stand and speak, but the agent raised her hand. "Don't," she said firmly. "We've seen the evidence. You know why we're here." The other officers in the room didn't move. Some looked shocked, others quietly relieved. Deep down, many had known something was wrong but hadn't dared to speak up. Now, justice had walked right through their front door. As the agents led the two men away in handcuffs, the town's news cameras began to arrive. Within minutes, photos and videos spread online. The same way the story had started, with one powerful image, it now came full circle. Only this time the picture showed the officers being taken away, their heads lowered, their authority stripped. Back at home, the man's phone started ringing. His wife answered, her voice trembling. "Yes, this is his wife." She listened for a moment, then covered the phone's speaker and looked at him. "They did it," she whispered. "They arrested them." He didn't react right away. He just sat there in silence, letting the words sink in. After all the fear, the nights of not sleeping, the anger, the doubt, justice had finally arrived. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "It's over," he said quietly. His wife hugged him tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. His daughters came running into the room. not fully understanding what was happening, but smiling because they could see their parents smiling for the first time in weeks. Outside, neighbors began to gather. Some clapped when they saw the news. Others simply nodded in respect. People who had once stayed silent now felt proud that someone from their own town had stood up for what was right. Later that day, the federal task force held a short press conference. The lead agent spoke clearly, explaining that the arrests were part of a wider investigation into misconduct and corruption. She didn't name all the details, but she promised transparency. She also mentioned the man's courage in coming forward, saying his honesty had helped uncover the truth. Reporters flooded the man's street again, but this time the attention felt different. It wasn't about questioning him or doubting him, it was about honoring his strength. One journalist asked if he wanted to make a statement. He thought for a moment, then said softly, "All I ever wanted was the truth to be known. I don't hate anyone. I just hope this helps things change so no one else has to go through what I did." His words spread across television screens and social media. People admired how calm and sincere he was, even after all he had suffered. Comments poured in from across the country, messages of support, empathy, and respect. Some said his story gave them courage to speak about their own experiences. Meanwhile, at the police department, more evidence continued to surface. The federal task force uncovered internal emails where officers joked about past incidents. They found hidden records of complaints that had never been reported to higher authorities. What started as one case now revealed a much deeper problem. The department's leadership was shaken. The chief eventually resigned, unable to defend the corruption any longer. Weeks went by and the case stayed in the headlines. People in the community began holding meetings to discuss rebuilding trust between law enforcement and residents. Churches, schools, and local leaders came together to start conversations about fairness and reform. It wasn't easy, but something important had begun. Through it all, the man kept living simply. He still went to work, still helped his neighbors, still smiled at strangers in the grocery store. But people saw him differently now. To them, he wasn't just the man from the video anymore. He was a symbol of quiet strength, someone who stood for truth even when it seemed impossible. One afternoon, as he walked through the park with his wife, an elderly woman stopped him. She reached out her hand and said, "You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us." He smiled humbly and replied, "I just did what anyone should do." At night, when the house grew quiet, he sometimes sat on the porch looking at the stars. The world still felt heavy with problems, but at least he had done his part to make it better. He thought about the people who had supported him, the strangers who had shared his story, and the investigators who had refused to give up. In his heart, he felt something that had been missing for a long time: peace. A few weeks later, the task force sent him a letter. It thanked him for his bravery and explained that the investigation had helped them open several other cases across the state. His case had become the spark for something much bigger, a movement toward justice and reform. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small box, next to his work ID badge and the uniform he had worn that day. Those things reminded him how far he had come, from being wrongly accused to standing as proof that truth can't be buried forever. That night, his wife found him sitting quietly, looking thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He smiled gently. "I'm thinking that maybe everything happened for a reason. Maybe this was supposed to wake people up." She nodded, sitting beside him. "And it did," she said softly. The air outside was calm, filled with the sound of crickets and a gentle breeze. It was peaceful, something they hadn't felt in a long time. The storm had passed, and though the scars remained, there was a new beginning waiting for them. In that quiet moment, under the soft glow of the porch light, he finally allowed himself to breathe freely. Justice had come, not through anger or revenge, but through truth, courage, and patience. And as he looked up at the sky, he whispered to himself, "Sometimes, even when it feels like no one's listening, the truth still finds its way."